You, Lucas whispers, eyes locked on hers. What are you doing here? The luxury cruise ship Infinity Experience sparkled under the golden glow of the setting sun. Docked at the private pier, it stood like a floating palace, ready to embark on its maiden voyage. VIP guests buzzed around the red-carpeted entrance, flashing their invitations and sipping champagne. Aria Bennett stepped onto the deck with a sense of fulfillment that couldn't be described in words. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor as she moved with grace and confidence, her black silk suit hugging her figure perfectly, her diamond brooch sparkling under the overhead lights. It had taken years, tears, and tireless nights to reach this moment. No one would guess that the woman now running the most luxurious cruise line in the world had once mopped floors for a living. No one could see the scars behind her smile. "Miss Bennett," her assistant called, rushing toward her with a clipboard. "VIP reception begins in 40 minutes. Your suite is on deck 7, suite 703. Aria nodded with a tired smile. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. Between press interviews, last-minute design checks, and legal briefings, her body was running on nothing but caffeine and adrenaline. "Just 30 minutes of quiet," she muttered under her breath, heading for her suite. The golden elevators hummed as they lifted her up, her reflection flickering in the mirrored walls. As she stepped into deck 7, her mind fogged slightly. Numbers swam before her eyes. She misread the suite number. 703 became 730. Her heels clicked softly as she opened the door, tossed her clutch onto the couch, and sank into the plush bed without turning on the lights. "I'll just close my eyes for 10 minutes, she whispered. The soft hum of the ocean outside the window lulled her to sleep within seconds. 30 minutes later, Lucas Thorne strode toward. At his suite, his expression unreadable. He had refused the red carpet, avoided the press, and declined the welcome drink. He didn't need pomp or pleasantries. This trip was about business, and maybe about clearing ghosts. He slid his card through the lock and entered the dim room, loosening his tie, and then he froze. There, curled up like an exhausted kitten in the center of his bed, lay a woman, a familiar woman. His heart stopped, his breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered, stepping closer. Even in the dim light, he could make out the curve of her jaw, that subtle scar beneath her brow. Only someone who had once kissed it would remember it. Her dark brown hair, now longer, spilled across his pillows like silk. It couldn't be. He blinked, wondering if this was a cruel hallucination. His hands trembled as he reached to switch on the bedside lamp. The light washed over her face, and every memory he'd buried deep inside came rushing back with punishing force. Aria Ramsey, the woman he once loved, the woman he left without a word, the woman who should never have been here. He stumbled back, breath hitching. As if sensing his presence, she stirred. Her lashes fluttered, brows furrowed in confusion. When her eyes opened and locked on his, time stopped. Both of them froze. Aria's breath caught, the color drained from her face. Lucas looked just the same, older perhaps, with sharper features and a colder stare, but still him, the same stormy blue eyes, the same square jaw, the same man who once held her heart and shattered it into a million pieces. "You," he whispered, disbelief coating his voice. "What are you doing here?" Aria bolted upright, disoriented. What is this?" she gasped. "This isn't my room." Lucas's jaw clenched. "No, it's my room." She looked around in horror and spotted the suite number on the welcome card. "Oh my God!" shook. He muttered, "It's 7:30. I was supposed to be in 7:03. This wasn't—" Her voice faltered. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Lucas took a slow step forward. "You just wandered in here, after all these years?" "Lucas," she said sharply, regaining her composure, "I didn't know this was your room. I didn't even know you'd be on this ship." They stared at each other, a decade's worth of unspoken rage and heartbreak swirling in the silence. "What are you doing here?" he asked again, this time quieter. Aria straightened her spine. "This is my ship." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Your ship?" "Yes," she said, voice icy now. "I'm the CEO of Bennett Luxury Voyages." Lucas flinched. He'd heard rumors, whispers of a woman rising through the ranks of luxury cruise lines like a storm, but he had never imagined, never dared imagine. It was her. The silence became unbearable. Arya stood from the bed, brushing down her clothes, reclaiming every inch of power she once lost. "I'll leave," she said, walking toward the door. But before she could touch the handle, he asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" She stopped. The question hung in the air like smoke, loaded, heavy, dangerous. Arya didn't turn. "You made it clear I wasn't welcome in your world." He closed his eyes. Guilt stabbed through him like a blade. No," she interrupted coldly, facing him now. "You don't get to explain. Not here. Not now." His throat tightened. Arya reached for the door again, but paused. "This ship has 2,000 guests. I suggest you stay out of my way." And with that, she walked out, heels clicking like thunder on marble. Lucas remained frozen in place. The smell of her perfume still lingered in the air. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He moved to the bed, sitting down where she had slept just minutes ago. He buried his face in his hands. He had questions. But more than that, he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answers, and it terrified him. Lucas sat alone in the suite, the silence stretching endlessly around him. The scent of her perfume still clung to his sheets, like a ghost refusing to leave. He stared at the door she had just walked through. His hands trembled slightly, a storm brewing in his chest. "Arya Bennett," he whispered to himself, as if saying her name would make the moment real. Not Ramsay. Bennett. She had changed everything, including her name. His mind reeled, her confidence, the way she spoke, the power in her stride. She wasn't the girl he left behind. She was someone else now, refined, fearless, successful. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. The memories started flooding in, ones he had long tried to bury beneath years of distraction, alcohol, women, and board meetings. She had been a chambermaid when he met her, quiet, warm, with an innocence that cut through the noise of his world like a melody in chaos. It had been at the Thorn Foundation's charity gala. He hadn't been looking for anyone. He was just another rich man in a tuxedo, bored of fake smiles and empty laughter. But Arya, she had been serving drinks, unaware he was watching her. There was something about her eyes, sad but curious. She didn't belong in that room, but neither did he. He remembered slipping away from the crowd just to get near her. "Isn't this beneath you?" she had asked him with a crooked smile when he first struck up a conversation. "Probably," he'd replied. "But so is pretending I like anyone in that room." They had laughed. That night, laughter had turned into long talks in hidden corners. Her voice, soft yet smart, enchanted him. By the end of the week, he was hooked. And so was she. They kept it a secret, of course. His mother, Eleanor Thorne, would have burned the entire city down before accepting a maid as her son's girlfriend. But secrecy only made the love more intoxicating. He remembered sneaking her onto private yachts, whispering promises beneath silk sheets, dreaming of a life that defied his family's legacy. And then he proposed. A small sapphire ring, nothing extravagant, just a promise between two hearts. She had cried when he got on one knee. "Are you sure?" she'd asked. "About you?" He had smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." But it didn't last. Not when Eleanor found out. He still remembered the day his mother stormed into his office, her heels clicking like a ticking bomb. "A chambermaid?" she had hissed. "You've lost your damn mind." "I love her," Lucas had said simply. "No, you're rebelling," she snapped, "and when you're done playing Romeo, she'll be gone." Lucas had refused to listen. He had planned the wedding anyway. Arya picked a small garden on the coast for the ceremony. Just 30 guests, close friends, no press, no spotlight. She wanted simplicity. He had promised her peace. But Eleanor wasn't finished. 3 days before the wedding, his mother gave him a file. A cruel file, fake records, twisted lies. Proof that Arya had lied about who she was, that she had stolen, manipulated, plotted her way into his life. "She's using you," Eleanor had said. "Don't let this ruin your name." Lucas had gone numb. He didn't ask Arya for the truth. He didn't confront her. He simply disappeared. He left her a note at the altar with the ring. "You'll never belong in my world." Even now the words made his stomach turn. Coward. He hadn't seen her since. Until tonight. And now, she was the CEO of a billion-dollar cruise empire. He couldn't process it. How had she risen so far? What had she suffered to get here? And why hadn't she ever come for revenge? He sat back down, head in his hands. Suddenly, a knock on the door startled him. It wasn't Arya. It was his assistant, Devon. "Sir, we need to finalize your panel appearance for tomorrow." Lucas nodded absent-mindedly. "Push it back." Devon hesitated. "There's a change in the event host lineup too. Apparently the keynote speaker is—" Lucas didn't need him to finish. He already knew. Arya. The universe wasn't done with him. Meanwhile, Arya leaned against the elevator wall, sad, steadying her breath. She could still feel the burn of his gaze, still hear his voice. "You'll never belong in my world." She had promised herself she'd never cry over him again. But the ache in her chest reminded her of the girl she used to be. The girl who wore borrowed heels on her wedding day. Who waited at a flowered altar for a man who never came. She hadn't told anyone what really happened. When he left her, her world had shattered. And just a week later, her test came back positive. Pregnant, with nowhere to go, with no one to trust. She had gone to Lucas's mansion one last time, clutching the result. But instead, she found Eleanor. The older woman had smiled coldly, as if she'd expected her. "I knew you'd come," she said, "but you won't find him here." Arya had tried to speak, but Eleanor silenced her with a check. $50,000. "A generous sum," she had said, eyes narrow. "Take it. Disappear. It's more than you'll ever be worth." Arya tore it in half. Eleanor hadn't flinched. "You'll learn soon enough," she'd whispered. "People like you don't survive in our world." She had slammed the door in her face. And that was the last time Arya ever tried to reach out. Now, 14 years later, Eleanor's words echoed like a challenge. But Arya hadn't just survived. She had conquered. And now, by fate or irony, Lucas had landed right in the heart of her empire. She wasn't the girl waiting at an altar anymore. She was the woman who owned the ocean. And this time, she wasn't leaving. The sun had long dipped beneath the horizon, but the city never slept. Neither did Arya. With one trembling hand gripping her swollen belly and the other clutching a plastic bag that held her last few belongings, she stood beneath the flickering streetlight outside the overcrowded women's shelter. The receptionist barely looked up as Arya was handed a thin blanket and pointed to an empty cot near the bathroom, the walls cracked, the air heavy with forgotten sorrow and silent suffering. Her body ached, her feet swollen, her eyes sunken from weeks of restless wandering after every door had closed on her. The once soft hands that used to smooth her lover's collar before galas were now blistered from cleaning subway stalls and begging shop owners for scraps. Her stomach clenched, not from hunger, but from the twisting pain of labor that began to claw its way through her spine. No one in the shelter even noticed as she collapsed to her knees, the tears falling silently while her breath hitched in broken rhythm. An old woman sleeping on the next cot nudged the staff, and within moments, the chaos of childbirth consumed the room. She screamed not only from the physical agony, but from the emotional torment that had built for months. The betrayal, the abandonment, the cruel silence from a man who had once promised forever. Hours passed like lifetimes. Her sweat mingled with tears, her cries echoing into the cracked ceiling as her body was torn apart to bring forth two lives she already loved more than anything she'd ever known. First came a boy, small and quiet, with hands that curled like rose petals and a crease between his brows like he was born already thinking too much. Then came a girl, louder, more demanding, her tiny lungs filling the shelter with a wail so fierce it shook Arya to her core. Nurses wrapped them in mismatched blankets, and as Arya held one against each arm, she wept. Not from pain, but from a tidal wave of love that replaced every ounce of bitterness. Her fingers traced their delicate faces, memorizing every eyelash, every wrinkle, every perfect curve of life she had created with nothing but heartbreak and hope. She hadn't chosen this path, but now that it was hers, she would walk it barefoot if she had to. She pressed a soft kiss to each forehead and whispered their names, Kai and Zara, promising them everything she never had. Her voice was hoarse, almost gone, but she found the strength to murmur one line, not to them, but to the universe. One day, he'll regret abandoning us. It wasn't said with vengeance, it was said with prophecy. That night, she didn't sleep. She watched over them like a soldier, swaddled them tighter each time they stirred, rocked them even when they didn't cry. And as the moonlight spilled through the broken blinds and danced across their tiny faces, Arya made another silent vow, not just to survive, but to rise. She wouldn't be another discarded name lost to statistics and shame. She would be a fortress. She would be the mother who rewrote her own fate. When food was short, she'd go hungry. When winter clawed through the walls, she'd wrap them in her own skin. Every bruise life gave her would become a stepping stone for them. She would be their home, their strength, their guide. No more begging. No more tears in front of strangers. Her pride had been shattered, but her purpose had just been born, and it had two tiny faces. She knew the road ahead would be cruel. Job interviews would turn her away because of her address. Landlords would slam doors on single mothers. The city would chew her up if she let it. But every time she looked at Kai's steady eyes and Zara's curious smile, she felt something greater than fear. She felt destiny. The twins, only hours old, had already become her reason for breathing, for fighting, for becoming a woman no one could ignore again. She had no money, no allies, no plan, but she had resolve, and that would be enough to carve a new path through the ashes. That night, while others in the shelter wept or prayed, Arya stayed awake, drawing invisible dreams in the air above her babies, whispering promises of warm beds, full plates, classrooms with windows, laughter and safety. Her fingers traced the ceiling like a canvas only she could see. In her mind, she saw a world where they thrived, where her name meant something, where the man who abandoned them would see her name lit across skylines and crumble. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about proving that being broken didn't mean being buried. The pain he left her with had become her power. She closed her eyes, her body exhausted but her spirit alive, and she imagined the first step, the one that would lead them away from pity and toward a future so bright it would blind the very man who walked away. She didn't need pity. She didn't want rescue. All she needed was a chance and the strength to keep walking. Tomorrow she'd find a way to work. Tomorrow she'd find someone who believed in more than just resumes and addresses. But tonight she'd just hold them, whispering to the universe once more, not for him to suffer, but for her children to shine. Morning sunlight broke through the shelter's dusty blinds, painting golden streaks across Arya's face as she held Kai and Zara to her chest, her arms aching, but her spirit sharpened like never before. She hadn't slept, but her eyes held a stormy clarity. Today had to be different. With trembling fingers, she folded a blanket around her babies, kissed their cheeks and whispered, "Stay strong for me," before rushing off to chase a whisper of hope she'd overheard the night before. Horizon Cruises was hiring for their cleaning crew, and it was the first thread of possibility she'd seen in weeks. She arrived at the towering corporate building with borrowed clothes, a wrinkled resume, and resolve in every step, the receptionist barely glancing her way until she softly said, "I'll clean anything." She started scrubbing floors with more purpose than most executives brought to boardrooms, often staying behind to fix broken tiles or quietly reorganize supplies, hoping someone, anyone, would notice that she was more than a mop and a uniform. Weeks passed, and while her title never changed, her work did. She started redesigning the housekeeping schedule for efficiency. She redrew route maps to save energy. One night she left a sketched idea for a kid-friendly luxury deck on the desk of a manager who never once smiled at her, and that idea accidentally found its way into a company-wide meeting. That was the first time anyone asked, "Who came up with this?" And for the first time in months, Her name was spoken with curiosity instead of pity. Then came Samuel Grant, an elusive, sharp-eyed investor known for betting on underdogs no one else dared to back. He overheard her passionately pitching a cruise program to a supervisor who had already tuned her out, and instead of laughing like the others, Samuel asked her to explain. She did, with nothing but her voice and a fire behind her words that years of abandonment and motherhood had forged like steel. He didn't flinch when she told him she had no degree. He didn't scoff when she admitted she lived in a shelter. He simply said, "You have vision. Let's build something." That moment felt like a dream folding into reality. With Samuel's seed investment and her tireless dedication, Aria launched Bennett Luxury Voyages from the corner of a shared desk in a rented co-working space, sketching blueprints with one hand while rocking Zara in a stroller with the other. Late nights blurred into early mornings as she balanced feeding schedules with corporate pitches, sometimes pausing mid-call to change a diaper or soothe Kai from a fever. She faced doubters, sneers, and sharks in suits who called her foolish, but she kept building, designing not just ships but experiences, healing spaces for people who wanted more than just ocean views. She refused to create floating palaces for the rich. She dreamed of floating sanctuaries for dreamers, widows, single parents, the tired, the bold. When it came time to name her first ship, she didn't hesitate. Phoenix. A symbol of rebirth, of fire that didn't destroy, but transformed. Its maiden voyage was humble, just a 3-day island loop with borrowed linens and second-hand decor, but it sold out in 2 days. Aria didn't just sell tickets, she sold purpose. Passengers cried during her opening speech because her voice carried the pain of someone who had lived without shelter, without certainty, and turned it into something that sailed. Headlines soon followed. From shelter to CEO, the woman behind the waves. Investors came calling, but Aria chose carefully, rejecting those who didn't respect her roots. She used her growing profits to fund childcare for employees, install medical bays on every deck, and create scholarship packages for underprivileged youth. She built Phoenix not just as a ship, but as a promise that broken beginnings could lead to breathtaking journeys. On launch night, she stood at the bow, wearing a rented suit and holding Kai and Zara's hands as fireworks exploded above. The twins squealed with laughter, unaware of how far their mother had come, but Aria just stared at the horizon, wind in her hair, heart thudding with pride, not for how much money she'd made, but for how much dignity she had rebuilt. She no longer needed validation from anyone who once shut a door on her. She had opened her own, big enough for others to walk through. Her name was no longer whispered in pity, but spoken with reverence in boardrooms. Her company was growing, but more importantly, her children were growing up, seeing a woman who never folded, never surrendered, never bowed. In quiet moments she'd whisper to herself, "You rose, Aria. You rose," and those words tasted sweeter than any apology ever could. Now, when she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the abandoned girl on the shelter floor. She saw a mother, a builder, a storm that refused to be silenced, and deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. As the final spark of the Phoenix launch faded into the night sky and the crowd slowly dispersed with glasses of champagne and murmurs of admiration, Aria guided Kai and Zara down the grand deck toward the kids' tech showcase scheduled for the next morning, unaware that fate was arranging a storm just beyond the horizon. The twins, now 14, carried themselves with a quiet brilliance that often went unnoticed until their minds began to speak. Kai, with his intense gaze and fingers always calculating invisible equations in the air, and Zara with her expressive tone, effortlessly switching between Spanish, French, Swahili, and Mandarin as she helped translate the welcome scripts for international guests aboard the cruise, their curiosity often leading them away from the public eye and into innovation corners meant for guests to engage with upcoming tech features. The next morning, inside the Infinity Experience's elite innovation lounge, a hush fell as children from around the world presented ideas during the Youth Brilliance Hour, a feel-good event for investors and elite guests to applaud cute drawings and clap politely. But when Kai took the mic with his neatly printed algorithms, a hush settled deeper, one that felt less like politeness and more like awe, As he outlined a real-time fuel consumption reducer he'd modeled using a recycled Raspberry Pi and predictive coding that mimicked machine learning behavior without even knowing the term. Zara followed with a sleek, AI-powered language translation headset she had been assembling quietly in their home's garage, her voice calm, confident, weaving a pitch that sounded like it belonged in a boardroom, not a youth presentation stage, and the audience shifted from amused to breathless. No one more still than Lucas Thorne, seated in the second row with a glass of sparkling water frozen mid-air, eyes locked on the stage, heart thudding with confusion and a growing sense of familiarity he couldn't explain. There was something in the boy's jawline, the shape of his brows, the way he folded his hands after his presentation, that stirred something uncomfortable in Lucas's memory. And when the girl spoke, his stomach twisted, not because of what she said, but because of how I said it, measured, eloquent, strong, and filled with that same melodic command he once heard from a woman who had stood across from him in a bridal garden before he vanished from her life. He didn't even realize he'd stood up until his assistant gently touched his sleeve, whispering, "Sir, are you all right?" To which he barely responded before muttering, "Who are those children?" His voice quiet, sharp, urgent, as if the answer might change everything. His assistant blinked, already checking the printed schedule. But Lucas's gaze never left the stage as the crowd erupted into applause, and Kai offered a shy nod while Zara bowed gracefully, the twins stepping down with practiced humility that only years of being raised by a grounded mother could instill. He watched them blend into the sea of guests, unaware that they had just disrupted a man's world without touching him, unaware that their presence had stirred a question he'd buried for years under success, denial, and regret. Backstage, Zara giggled as she teased Kai about his fast-talking nerves, and Kai, ever the introvert, smiled faintly, adjusting the straps of his backpack that carried more knowledge than most adults dared explore, while Arya stood nearby, proud but always in control, unaware that a familiar shadow was now watching from a distance, connecting dots he hadn't dared to consider. Lucas paced the lounge hallway in silence, reviewing the way Kai had frowned during equations, exactly how he used to when he couldn't balance a variable, and how Zara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear before speaking, just like Arya once did when nervous. Logic screamed coincidence, but instinct whispered something far more dangerous. He tapped his phone, scrolling through guest lists, trying to find names, birth years, anything. But nothing conclusive came up. His chest tightened as he realized these weren't just talented kids. They were puzzle pieces, and his soul seemed to recognize them before his mind dared to admit it. Elsewhere on the ship, Arya tucked the twins into their suite, the door clicking quietly behind her as she sighed in gratitude, not knowing that an old ghost was circling the corridors with 100 unsaid questions boiling under his skin. Lucas returned to his own room in silence, sitting on the edge of the bed as the weight of the past knocked louder than ever before, louder than champagne toasts, louder than business panels, louder than reason, because somewhere deep down, beneath layers of guilt and silence, he felt the impossible becoming inevitable. And it all started with two children who had no idea the man watching them held the key to everything they were never told. As the champagne bottles shattered against the hull of the Infinity, glittering like stars against steel, a buzz of excitement electrified the grand launch. Yet Arya stood quietly near the bow, her heart steady, eyes fierce, until Lucas emerged from the crowd, his face pale, voice trembling as he stepped onto the stage and demanded, "Are they mine?" The microphone catching every syllable, amplifying it across the sea of press, guests and crew, as silence devoured the laughter, and cameras whipped toward the confrontation, their flashing bulbs slicing through the tension. Arya, taken off guard but unwilling to flinch, stared him down, 1,000 memories flooding her eyes, pain, betrayal, and the long road she'd walked alone. But before she could speak, a small hand gripped her side, and Kai, composed beyond his years, stepped forward in his suit, voice sharp, clear, and unafraid, declaring, "You're the man who broke my mom's heart," sending a ripple through the crowd like a storm at sea, as murmurs broke out and gasps rippled like dominoes. Lucas's face twisted, shock, guilt, recognition, all battling across his expression as he looked down at the boy, then to Zara, whose eyes mirrored his own, as if nature had painted her with his palette, her braided hair blowing in the ocean wind like a banner of unspoken truth. Arya stepped slightly forward, not to protect, but to stand beside her son, her posture regal, every inch of her saying, "I survived without you," while Lucas stumbled back, half at her. "Step!" His assistant whispering urgently, but he couldn't hear, couldn't breathe, couldn't unsee the living proof of what he had abandoned. A video was already trending, guests muttering, some filming, some whispering to the press, while others looked on in silent awe at the woman who had once been discarded like a torn page, now standing center stage, with two brilliant children who commanded the moment like stars born from fire. Lucas tried to speak, but his voice caught. He had practiced this confrontation 1,000 times in his mind, always as the hero, always in control. But now, faced with the undeniable truth and the unflinching glare of a child whose intellect cut sharper than any adult's scorn, he faltered. Arya tilted her chin slightly, calm but burning inside, knowing that this confrontation would shape not only their future, but her children's legacy, and she would not allow them to be diminished or hurt again. Not by this man, not by his regret, not by the crowd's curiosity. Kai stepped forward again, this time holding out something, Lucas's old business card, the one Arya had kept all these years in a weathered box, and Lucas blinked, stunned, recognizing his own handwriting on the back, a note he'd scribbled in haste long ago. "Call me if you ever need help." A cruel irony now echoing through time. Zara stood silent, but her presence was thunderous. Her eyes locked on Lucas like a mystery she had already solved, and the crowd waited, breath held, phones recording, the ocean still, as if the world itself paused to hear Arya's answer. But she said nothing, not yet, because in this moment her children were speaking truths that didn't need her translation, and Lucas, broken by realization, whispered, "I didn't know." But Kai cut him off. "You didn't want to know," before turning to his mother and saying, "Come on, Mom, we have a ship to sail." And the crowd erupted. No, it in laughter, not in cruelty, but in stunned respect as the trio turned from Lucas and began walking down the gold-lit aisle, heads high, hearts unshaken, while Lucas stood alone, trembling, the weight of everything he had lost, pressing down like the anchor of a ship he never deserved to board. A heavy silence clung to the deck of the Infinity like a storm cloud after Kai's piercing words cut through the air, his small voice somehow louder than the roaring sea around them. "You're the man who broke my mom's heart." Lucas staggered back as if struck, his breath catching while the crowd fell into a hush so complete it made every gasp, every camera click thunderous. Arya's face flushed with a mix of dread and determination as she instinctively placed an arm protectively in front of her children, her eyes burning into Lucas's like a storm refusing to retreat. Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but the flashing lights of phones capturing every angle of the confrontation left him speechless, vulnerable, exposed. The video spread like wildfire before the event even ended. #Billionaire secret. Twins trended globally within the hour, and the world watched, judged, and chose sides. Media headlines screamed betrayal, arrogance, fatherhood denied. Lucas's board of directors called emergency meetings, investors pulled out. Reporters swarmed his estate like vultures circling fresh ruin. Meanwhile, Arya, who once slept in shelters and fed her babies with trembling hands, found herself hailed as the phoenix who'd risen with dignity from the ashes. Stock in Bennett Luxury Voyages soared. Shares doubled overnight as public sympathy and admiration turned into financial support. Despite the chaos, Arya remained grounded, ushering her kids into a private room away from the media madness, but she couldn't hide from the quiet storm brewing in their young hearts. Zara, normally so quiet and observant, finally broke down, her eyes shimmering as she clutched Arya's wrist. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice trembling like a leaf in wind, her lips quivering not in anger, but deep confusion. Arya's strength shattered for a moment as she knelt before her daughter, gently cupping her tear-streaked face. "Because I wanted to protect you," she whispered, voice cracking under the weight of years filled with loneliness and silent sacrifice. Kai clenched his fists, not out of rage, but from the swirl of betrayal that children shouldn't have to process. his prodigy mind unable to solve the equation of absence and love. Lucas, still rooted to the deck, watched them with wet eyes, but Arya didn't look his way again. She led the twins away from the lights, away from the man who now bore the world's scorn, leaving him standing there, once a titan, now a man unraveling. News clips played the scene in slow motion across every screen. Talk shows dissected every expression, and the public's opinion turned from adoration to disappointment as people demanded accountability from the man who once inspired millions. Lucas's empire buckled beneath the weight of truth, while Arya's authenticity lifted her into circles she once only dreamed of. Yet it was the pain behind Zara's question that haunted her more than any business rivalry ever could. That night, while Lucas sat in a penthouse devoid of laughter and future, Arya sat with her children wrapped in her arms, answering every question they had, gently but honestly, planting seeds of healing in hearts that had waited too long for truth. The betrayal had passed, the confrontation had gone viral, but the scars it left behind were real, etched not just in headlines but in the fragile trust of two brilliant children who discovered the world wasn't as fair as the bedtime stories they once believed. And as the world watched and judged, only one thing mattered now: rebuilding from truth, and never letting silence stand in the way of love again. Arya's breath hitched at Zara's innocent but soul-piercing question, her voice trembling as if her daughter's words had cracked open years of buried pain. The cameras had faded, the noise of the world now just a distant echo, as Arya knelt before her children, her lips quivering. "Because I wanted to protect you," she whispered, clutching both twins as if shielding them from the cruel truths the world had begun to devour. Meanwhile, across glossy newsrooms and digital screens worldwide, the name Arya Bennett soared like a phoenix reborn. While the Thorn Empire, once untouchable, teetered on the edge of disgrace, the hashtag had Billionaire Secret Twins, not just trending, but blazing through headlines like a wildfire. And as public curiosity boiled into outrage, a new storm erupted when Eleanor Thorne, Lucas's icy and controlling mother, stepped into a primetime interview dressed in cold pearls and colder intent, her voice sharp as she declared with venom, "That girl was always after Lucas's wealth. She's nothing but a gold digger who trapped him with children for power," sending shockwaves through society, but not the ones she intended. For within hours, a faceless whistleblower dropped a set of damning documents to every major outlet, emails, test results, and legal drafts, proof that Lucas had known about Arya's pregnancy, and even tried to cover it up with hush contracts that Arya refused to sign, evidence that shattered the Thorns' carefully curated legacy like glass under pressure. Reporters scrambled to reframe their narrative, and investors began pulling out of Thorn Enterprises like rats fleeing a sinking ship, while social media exploded in fury over Eleanor's lies and Lucas's cowardice. And suddenly the woman who had once been mocked as a single mother became a symbol of strength, an underdog who fought in silence and rose without vengeance, her children now front and center in a global tale of betrayal and justice. Arya's company, Bennett Luxury Voyages, saw a meteoric rise in stock value, with millions of women, single mothers, dreamers, survivors, flocking to her brand as a sign of empowerment, and Samuel Grant, her earliest investor, smiled through tears in a quiet interview as he said, "I believed in her when she had nothing but an idea. Now look at her." In a shocking twist of poetic justice, Arya's net worth officially surpassed the Thorns, an announcement that shattered the financial world's expectations and left Lucas in stunned silence as he stared at the charts from his cold, lonely office, Arya's face smiling on every screen while his boardroom sat in ruin. Eleanor, now disgraced and cornered, tried to retract her statement, but it was too late. The world had chosen their heroine, and her name was Arya. Reporters clamored outside her residence and business headquarters, but she kept silent, choosing dignity over drama, holding Kai and Zara's hands during quiet breakfasts and late-night talks, answering their questions one at a time, hugging them through their confusion and pride. And in a final blow, Thorn Enterprises was removed from the elite Horizon investment circle, a space Arya was now personally invited to join as Lucas watched from afar, pale and hollow-eyed, realizing he hadn't just lost his fortune, he'd lost the one woman who had loved him purely, and the children who now carried his name, but not his heart. Lucas stood amidst the ruins of his once glorious empire, his tailored suit wrinkled, and his voice trembling as he faced Arya and the children he had never known, his eyes hollow, haunted by the truth that had unraveled under the brutal glare of the world's spotlight. Once the untouchable billionaire, he now looked like a man stripped bare by fate. His pride shattered and his arrogance burned to ash as he dropped to his knees before Arya during a press conference outside her global headquarters, the same place he had laughed at years ago when she begged him for help. His hands shaking as he held out the $300 million trust fund documents, offering wealth he once worshipped like a god, his voice cracking as he whispered, "Please, forgive me. I want to be their father. I want to make it right." But Arya, now the powerful CEO of Bennett Luxury Voyages, the woman he underestimated and discarded, stood tall and unshaken in her cream power suit, her eyes colder than any storm he had ever weathered, lifting her chin as the cameras zoomed in, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade as she said, "Money can't buy back 14 years of tears, of birthdays missed, of tiny footsteps echoing in shelters, of my son holding my hand when I was too weak to walk, of Zara learning to say mama without ever knowing her father's voice. Your absence was louder than any dollar you now wave in my face." The crowd gasped again, some wiping tears, while others looked on with stunned reverence as Arya turned from him, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her twins following her with quiet grace. But before she could reach the exit, Kai stepped forward, the 14-year-old prodigy whose mind outpaced his age, holding the trust documents that had somehow found their way into his hands. He looked at them for a long moment, then back at the man who shared his face but not his journey, and with a calm maturity that silenced the room, he said, "You think this will undo what you did? You think this is love? Real fathers show up, not when cameras do, not when empires fall, but when nightmares wake us up at 3 a.m., and we need someone to tell us everything will be okay." Then, without blinking, he ripped the documents in half, walked over to the donation box of a foundation his mother had recently launched for women in crisis, and placed them inside, a symbolic act that shook the internet and set fire to every news outlet's headlines. Later that evening, he would make it official, announcing the entire $300 million would be used to support shelters for single mothers, trauma survivors, and abandoned children, sparking what journalists began calling the Kai effect, a movement led by a boy who had every reason to hate, but chose instead to heal. And as he stood there, hand in hand with Zara, who had buried her face in her mother's arm moments earlier, crying and asking why they were never told about their father, the world saw not broken children, but warriors molded by love, by resilience, and by a woman who refused to let betrayal define her. Lucas, still on his knees, looked on as the family he never claimed now became a symbol of strength, and as the crowd began to clap, slow, rising, powerful applause that swept across the plaza like a tide, he realized that no amount of regret could rewind time, that all the money he once used to silence truths now only echoed his failure. And as Arya turned back for one final glance, she didn't smile or cry. She simply said, "You walked away once. We kept walking. You'll never catch up," before disappearing into her waiting car, leaving Lucas surrounded by his own silence, the thunder of the people's cheers chasing after the woman he lost and the children he would never truly know. Kai stood firm in the quiet, his fingers clenched into fists as the early morning sunlight poured through the panoramic glass windows of the coastal penthouse Arya had recently acquired. Beside him, Zara sat upright, her expression calm but eyes storming with questions. The previous night had been a whirlwind, media chaos, Lucas's tear-stained plea, the rejection that echoed across social platforms, and the symbolic act that turned heads worldwide. Kai's powerful decision to donate the entire $300 million trust to single mothers in shelters, the very place Arya had once birthed them in pain and solitude. Now, the twins were silent, contemplative. But when Lucas's assistant nervously called to request a meeting at a neutral location, Kai took a breath and said, "On our terms." They chose a quiet marine observatory by the sea, a place Arya had taken them every birthday, a sacred spot filled with stargazing, wisped, dreams, and no shadows of betrayal. When Lucas arrived, his suit immaculate but his eyes hollow, he hesitated before stepping out of the car. He scanned the area, searching, not for threats, but for absolution. Zara saw it, but Kai didn't flinch. As Lucas approached, his voice trembled. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." The silence that followed was deafening. Zara tilted her head. "Why now?" she asked, voice crystalline and heavy. "Because I was a coward," Lucas admitted. "I didn't know how to face the damage I caused. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it'd go away." Kai stepped forward slowly, his posture a mirror of Arya's strength, his chin lifted in quiet defiance. "If you hurt Mom again," he said with a voice so steady it made Lucas blink, "I'll destroy you." The words didn't come from hate, but from protection. They were a vow, echoing Arya's resilience, shaped by years of watching her rebuild her world with dignity, brick by scarred brick. Lucas swallowed hard. "I deserve that," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve a place in your life, but I'm asking, not as a billionaire, not as a thorn, but as a man trying to right a catastrophic wrong." Zara looked away, her eyes trailing a pod of dolphins swimming freely beyond the glass. "Do you even know what her favorite meal is?" she asked. Lucas hesitated. "Peach cobbler," he said, remembering the one dish she used to make on rainy Sundays. Kai glanced sideways at his sister. They weren't impressed by facts, but by effort, by pain that turned into responsibility. "You didn't just leave her," Kai added. "You left us. You weren't there when Zara broke her arm. You weren't there when I cried because we couldn't afford a science kit. She made magic out of nothing. She gave us the universe, and you gave us your absence." Lucas stepped back, visibly wounded by the truth. "I can't rewrite the past," he said, voice raw, aching. "But if I can be there for your future, even as a shadow, I will." Zara's voice softened. "We're not promising anything. This isn't a movie where one apology makes it okay. You'll have to show up, consistently, humbly, quietly. Because we already have a family, we're just letting you try to be part of it." Lucas's eyes brimmed. "I will." The twins turned, heading for the stairs. Kai paused and looked back. "Don't make her cry again," he said, "because next time there won't be a second meeting." And with that, they left him standing amidst the sea breeze and crashing waves, alone, but with a flicker of hope, a thread of redemption, and the unbearable weight of a father finally seeing the cost of walking away. Arya stood beneath a golden sky as cameras flashed, her silhouette poised in front of the towering glass entrance of the New Horizons Foundation headquarters, an architectural marvel born not of wealth alone, but of battle scars turned into building blocks. As her voice rang out during the grand opening ceremony, emotions rippled through the gathered crowd of women, many clutching their children's hands or wiping away silent tears. Arya spoke not like a CEO, but like a woman who had once slept in shelters, hidden her pregnancy in fear, and built empires from ashes. "This isn't about charity," she declared. "It's about rewriting the rules for women who were told they'd never rise." The room erupted with applause, but Arya's eyes remained calm, her mind rooted in the promise she'd made herself 14 years ago, when the world had branded her broken and unworthy. Now she was the woman lifting others. The foundation offered seed grants, mentorship programs, housing initiatives, and maternal support networks, focusing especially on single mothers, abandoned partners, and overlooked girls with brilliance in their bones. Meanwhile, headlines screamed irony across the globe. Lucas Thorne's empire eclipsed by X's rise. Billionaire's X builds fortune while his new marriage crumbles. In a quiet suburb, Lucas stared hollow-eyed at the letter left by his second wife. "You built a life on secrets and silence. I deserve truth, not luxury." Alone again, he found himself haunted not by what he'd lost, but by what he'd thrown away. His calls to Arya went unanswered. His attempts to contact Kai and Zara were met with stiff, polite deferrals. "We're busy with the Foundation launch." Arya had taught them boundaries as much as she'd taught them bravery. Inside the Foundation's newly unveiled family hall, hundreds of framed photos lined the walls, portraits of mothers and children supported by Arya's vision. One photo stood taller than the rest, a younger Arya in a tattered coat holding newborn twins beneath a street lamp, her eyes full of fire. Beneath it, a plaque read, "From pain, purpose, from silence, strength." Across town, Eleanor Thorne watched the televised launch with lips pursed in disbelief. "She was nothing," she muttered. "How did she become this?" But deep inside, even Eleanor knew, it was because Arya had faced the fire and dared to build from it. As evening fell, a gala celebrated the Foundation's debut, attended by investors, activists, and former critics now turned allies. Zara took the stage with confident elegance, delivering a speech in 6 languages that moved the room to tears. "Our mother didn't just raise us," she said. "She raised a movement." Beside her, Kai presented data on the Foundation's early impact, drawing gasps as he revealed how $50 million in grants had already reached underserved communities within months. In the crowd, a woman fainted from emotion, whispering, "She saved me." The music swelled. Arya, standing off stage, held back tears. She had once been denied a seat at every table. Now she owned the whole building. Reporters asked if she had anything to say to Lucas. She paused, then replied softly, "I have nothing to say to the past. I'm too busy shaping the future." Lucas, watching from his fumes, and House shattered his glass of whiskey against the wall as her words echoed through the screen. That night, as Arya tucked a handwritten letter from a saved mother into her journal, she smiled, not for victory over Lucas, but for victory over every night she almost gave up. The next morning she met with a council of women she once mentored, now CEOs themselves, and drafted plans for international expansion. The New Horizons Foundation wasn't a company, it was a revolution. As the sun rose on the city's skyline, casting light through the stained glass windows of the Foundation's prayer room, Arya knelt, not to beg, but to give thanks. Her legacy was no longer tied to a man's name or shadow, it was her own. A legacy born not in boardrooms or bank vaults, but in brokenness transformed into brilliance. One by one, as women walked through the Foundation's doors, they stepped not into charity, but into a future someone had once fought for them to have. And Arya Bennett, she wasn't done fighting. Not even close. Arya stood at the edge of her penthouse balcony, the golden hues of sunset reflecting in her eyes like fire kissed with peace, as the wind gently played with the silk scarf around her shoulders, the same scarf her mother once gave her when life felt uncertain. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Revenge wasn't the goal. Building something better was." A mantra born not from pain, but evolution. And as the city below buzzed with whispers of her legacy, the weight of 1,000 broken days fell off her shoulders like dust finally swept from a forgotten frame. Inside, Zara sat at the piano composing her first original piece for the Foundation's gala, her fingers dancing like hope across ivory keys while Kai flipped through scholarship applications from single mothers around the world. Women who saw themselves in Arya and now saw a future in their children's eyes, a chance made possible by one woman's refusal to stay buried. Every wall of the penthouse told a story now. Paintings from global artists who had once been silenced, letters from orphans who could now read cause of the literacy centers funded by Arya's New Horizons Foundation, and photos of women once homeless now opening businesses under her mentorship program. And yet, in the quiet of this sanctuary, Arya never felt arrogant, only humbled, because her success wasn't draped in diamonds, but in dignity. Across town, Lucas sat alone in a decaying office that once roared with ambition, now echoing only silence and regret. His tie loosened, face sunken, watching a news broadcast that showcased Arya shaking hands with world leaders at the Global Impact Summit, her name etched on the donation wall of the UN as the youngest woman of color to ever fund a global education campaign. He stared, hollow-eyed, at the woman who once begged him to believe in their children, the woman he called temporary while marrying a socialite who left him the moment scandal tainted his last name. He tried to reach for the remote, but his fingers trembled, the weight of failure not in the collapse of his empire, but in the absence of a family that once could have been his pride. Tears welled up as Zara's voice echoed from the screen, giving a speech. "My mother didn't just give birth to us, she gave birth to a movement." And next to her, Kai added, "And no man who walked away from her truth will ever write our story again." Lucas clutched his chest, not from illness, but from aching realization, the kind that strikes when you see someone glow in the fire you tried to put out. And while the world celebrated Aria, Time magazine's Woman of the Decade, tech moguls offered partnerships and universities invited her as commencement speaker, she remained grounded, watering her plants, texting her best friend from college, laughing at Zara's jokes and hugging Kai when his social anxiety flared before interviews. Forgiveness had found her, not as a gift from others, but a choice she made for herself. The paid. And Lucas' cause had become soil for her purpose. The lies he told had become bricks in her foundation, and the betrayal he offered had become wind in her wings. In a twist, cruel and poetic, Lucas's final investor pulled out live on air, blaming lack of ethics and trust, while the building he once called Thorn Tower dimmed its lights, forever shut. Back in the penthouse, Aria raised a glass of water, not champagne, and toasted to herself in the mirror. Not for being flawless, but for surviving, rebuilding, and choosing peace over bitterness. She smiled at her reflection, older, wiser, softer, but stronger. And behind her, Kai and Zara joined her, arms around her waist, whispering, "We love you, Mom." In that moment, she didn't feel like a billionaire, or a media icon, or a fallen man's forgotten past. She felt like home. Far away, Lucas turned off the TV and stared at the dark window, his own reflection unfamiliar and aged, whispering to no one. The greatest punishment wasn't losing her. It was realizing she never needed me at all.